So today I'd like to introduce you to this musical object that has fascinated me recently called the color tree. I'm calling it the color tree. I haven't seen this anywhere else, which is why I'm making this video. So if you have seen this somewhere else, please do leave me a comment and I'd love to hear from you. And I'd love to give credit where credit is due. But what is this object? Essentially what it does is it organizes musical colors from simple to complicated and from dark to bright. And I'm going to lay it all out on this grid here and build it up from scratch, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So what is the simplest musical color? Well, you could argue that it's just one note, and I would say that the harmonic series kind of tells you what is closest to that fundamental pitch that you've chosen. So we're just going to call that 1, and then the first interval that the harmonic series gives us is the octave. So either we could add unison, the same note, over and over again, or we could add octaves to it up and down, but we're not really making the sound any more complex or colorful or brighter. It's just sort of saying neutral, and it's just one note. So that's what this first row represents, is that it's just one note, the fundamental pitch from which we're going to branch out and we're going to add all of this color and complexity. And here I'm just using some numbers to illustrate that we've not added anything to this first number. So it's just one note. So what's the next more complicated interval besides the octave? The fifth. That's the next interval defined by the harmonic series, followed by the fourth, the major third, the minor third, etc. But we're just going to stick with fourths and fifths, and we're going to find that fourths and fifths are symmetrical, that they're essentially the same thing, but just in different directions. So I'm going to put up the circle of fifths with numbers here rather than letters. You probably have heard of the circle of fifths before, but if you haven't, essentially you can get all 12 notes of the Western harmony system by stacking fifths, and you'll end up where you started after 12 steps. With a slight caveat that if we're in equal temperament and not just intonation, which is what the harmonic intervals generate. But we're not going to talk about that today. Just assuming that fifths after stacking 12 times, you'll come back to where you started. And I'm also going to put the order of the circle of fourths, because that is equivalent to subtracting fifths. So if you take some note, let's say C, because most people can visualize C pretty well, and you add a fifth, you get G, which is the fifth scale degree of C. And if you subtract a fifth from C, you get F, which is the fourth scale degree of C. But I'm not going to use any more note names for the rest of the video. I'm just going to speak in terms of numbers and the intervallic relationships and scale degree relationships. But the order of the notes that are added as we step up the complexity, or the amount of notes we add, is here. And that's the circle of fifths and the circle of fourths. Okay. So that's row 1. Row 2 is the next more complicated row, and we're going to add one note. But we can either add it above or below. We're just going to use this fifth as a building block. So above, we get 1 and 5, and below, we get 1 and 4. And so these two colors are just as simple or complex as each other, but one is brighter and one is darker. One is going to one direction and one is going to the other direction. And here are the numbers that illustrate that move that we just made. So -1, +1. We haven't added or subtracted any more than just one note in either direction. Okay? So the next row, we have our first convergence, where you could go to the right and then go to the left, or you could go to the left and then go to the right, and you'd end up in this middle box, 1, 4, 5. So those two paths are kind of equivalent, +1, -1. And those are the numbers that we use to illustrate that. And then you can see that on the right, we get 1, 2, 5, which is 2 fifths stacked on top of each other. So a fifth and a fifth, you get a ninth, or the second scale degree. So I'm just putting that in numerical order to make it easier to read, as if it was a scale, 1, 2, 5. And on the left, the darker mode of this family is 1, 4, flat, 7. But I'm saying all of these colors are the same simplicity or complexity, but now we're organizing them from dark to bright. All right, so the next row, we have 4 notes organized like this. And you could call this tetratonic, or I don't know, something like that, quadratonic. And here we can see that there are 4 modes, but there's no middle box, which means that in this row of 4 note colors, there's no neutral color. You're either leaning dark or bright. But we do get a neutral color in the next row, which is the pentatonic row. And you might recognize the brightest pentatonic scale here as major pentatonic, and the second darkest as minor pentatonic, which sort of implies that it's not really the most minor or the darkest pentatonic. That should be 1, flat 3, 4, flat 6, flat 7. But it also defines a neutral pentatonic scale, 1, 2, 4, 5, flat 7, which is very popular all over the world. And here are the numbers that illustrate those paths. So you could get to minor pentatonic either by going left 3 steps and then 1 step over, or you could go 1 step over and then 3 steps left, or you could go 2 steps left, 1 step right, and then 1 step left, and still end up in minor pentatonic, in that minor pentatonic box. So that's already pretty interesting, but now here comes row 6, our hexatonic scales, which aren't as common as the pentatonic scales, but are used all the time, all over the world. And here are the numbers that sort of represent what's going on there. But where it really gets juicy is the 7th row. And I think that's a good place to stop, because this is a 12-row object, but what happens at row 7 is all of the major modes pop out in order, from Locrian to Lydian, darkest to brightest, with Dorian actually being a neutral color, arguably. That it's not minor or major. Even though it has a minor third, it has all of these other major colors like the 5th and the 6th and the 2, which are very bright. Whereas something like Locrian doesn't even have a 5th, because 5ths are brighter than 4ths. So you see it's only the 4th and the flat 5th on that scale. And here are the numbers that represent that row. So this is the sort of first part of the color tree. And you can see that it implies a lot of interesting connections between some knowledge that you probably already have and some other colors that you might not have considered as options, like 1 flat 3, 4 flat 7 as a minor color, a dark color, but with no other colors added. So it remains simple while still being dark, but it's not quite as dark as Locrian. So this is the first 7 rows of the color tree. I hope you find this as interesting as I do. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please do leave them for me. I'll be happy to discuss them with you. And more soon. But thanks so much for watching. I'll see you again soon.